The steel hull of the submarine groaned under the immense pressure of the dark Atlantic Ocean, while the crew held their breath in the stagnant air. Every man inside the iron tube stood frozen at his post, and eyes darted nervously toward the ceiling, as if they could see through the metal plating. The terrifying sound of propeller blades churned the water above them and grew louder with every passing second, until it hammered against their ears like a rhythmic drum of death. The destroyer on the surface was hunting them, and its sonar pings echoed through the water like the ghostly fingers of a giant searching for prey in the deep. The captain signaled for absolute silence, and sweat dripped from his brow onto the cold deck plates. Suddenly, the ocean floor seemed to erupt as a pattern of depth charges detonated around the submerged vessel with earth-shattering force. The submarine lurched violently to the starboard side and threw men from their feet, while glass dials on the instrument panels shattered into jagged fragments. The lights flickered and died before the emergency red lighting bathed the chaotic scene in a blood-colored glow that heightened the terror. Leaks sprang from the high-pressure lines and hissed like angry serpents, while jets of freezing seawater sprayed across the control room. The crew scrambled to seal the valves, and their hands slipped on the oily wet metal as they fought to keep their steel coffin from becoming a permanent grave. The explosion subsided eventually, but the silence that followed was even more agonizing for the sailors trapped beneath the waves. They knew the enemy destroyer was still up there and waiting for the slightest sound to unleash another barrage of underwater explosives. The captain watched the depth gauge with intense concentration and calculated their remaining battery power against the oxygen levels that were dropping dangerously low. This was the reality of the underwater war, where the hunter could become the hunted in a heartbeat, and survival depended on nerves of steel. They were the silent predators of the deep, but in moments like these, they felt like trapped animals waiting for the slaughter. Hours passed in the suffocating darkness before the captain finally gave the order to blow the ballast tanks and surface the vessel. The submarine rose slowly through the water column and broke the surface of the rolling Atlantic with a cascade of white foam. The hatch was thrown open and fresh salty air rushed into the stale interior, while the diesel engines roared to life with a coughing sputter. The men climbed onto the conning tower and scanned the horizon with binoculars to look for the silhouette of the destroyer against the moonlit sky. The ocean was empty now, and the vast expanse of black water hid the deadly game of cat and mouse that played out every night. The stakes of this silent war were nothing less than the survival of the island nation of Great Britain and the outcome of the entire conflict in Europe. The United Kingdom relied on a massive lifeline of merchant ships to import food and fuel and raw materials from North America and the colonies. Without these supplies, the British war machine would grind to a halt, and the population would face starvation within a matter of months. The German Naval Command understood this vulnerability perfectly and aimed to sever the arteries of trade that kept the Allied heart beating. If the submarines could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, then victory would belong to Germany. This strategic stranglehold focused on the North Atlantic shipping lanes, where convoys of slow-moving merchant vessels braved the rough seas and the threat of attack. The ocean was a vast and unforgiving battlefield where there was nowhere to hide, and help was often hundreds of miles away. The German High Command calculated that sinking a specific tonnage of shipping each month would force Britain to surrender regardless of the situation on the land battlefields. It was a cold and mathematical approach to warfare where success was measured in gross register tons sent to the bottom of the sea. The men on the merchant ships knew the odds were stacked against them, but they sailed anyway. At the center of this underwater offensive stood the most successful submarine ace of the war named Otto Kretschmer. He was a man of discipline and tactical brilliance who earned the nickname Silent Otto for his ability to infiltrate convoys without being detected. Kretschmer did not fit the propaganda image of a fanatical warrior, but was instead a professional naval officer who viewed the war with a detached and calculating efficiency. He believed that the submarine was not just a defensive weapon, but an offensive sword that should be wielded with aggression and precision. His leadership style inspired fierce loyalty among his crew, who trusted him to bring them home alive from every patrol. Otto Kretschmer revolutionized the tactics of submarine warfare, by insisting that his boat remain on the surface at night to attack convoys from within their defensive perimeter. While other commanders fired torpedoes from a distance, he preferred to penetrate the escort screen and pick off targets at point-blank range. His motto was one torpedo for one ship, and he drilled his men relentlessly to achieve this level of deadly economy. This daring approach required nerves of steel and immense skill, as it placed his fragile vessel right in the middle of the enemy formation. The confusion he created often led the escorts to fire at shadows while he slipped away into the darkness. The weapon of choice for commanders like Kretschmer was the Type 7 submarine, which became the workhorse of the German naval fleet. These vessels were not true submarines in the modern sense, but rather submersible torpedo boats that spent most of their time on the surface. They were cramped and uncomfortable and lacked basic amenities like showers or fresh food storage for long patrols. The interior was a maze of pipes and valves and machinery that left little room for the crew to move or sleep. Yet despite these limitations, the Type 7 was a rugged and reliable machine that could dive quickly to escape danger and endure the punishing storms of the Atlantic. Life inside the iron hull was a psychological and physical ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance for weeks at a time. The air was perpetually foul and smelled of diesel oil and moldy bread and unwashed bodies, and the chemical tang of battery acid. Fresh water was strictly rationed for drinking only, and the men grew beards and wore the same oil-stained clothes for the duration of the mission. Privacy was non-existent, as sailors slept in shifts on warm bunks that were shared between watch rotations. The constant noise of the engines and the fear of sudden death created a pressure cooker environment where camaraderie was the only thing that kept insanity at bay. The German naval strategy evolved under the command of Admiral Karl Donitz, who devised the wolf pack tactic to overwhelm Allied defenses. Instead of operating alone, the submarines would form a patrol line across the likely path of a convoy and wait for a sighting. Once a boat spotted the enemy, it would not attack immediately, but would shadow the convoy and broadcast a homing signal to the rest of the pack. Other submarines in the area would converge on the location and gather for a coordinated strike once darkness fell. This concentration of force allowed them to overwhelm the escort ships and strike from multiple directions simultaneously. Communication was the key to the wolf pack system, and radio signals crisscrossed the Atlantic to coordinate the movements of the scattered boats. The German command center in occupied France directed the operations like a grand chess game and moved pieces across the map based on intelligence reports. The submarines relied on the Enigma machine to encrypt their messages and believed that their codes were unbreakable to enemy listeners. This reliance on radio traffic would eventually become a vulnerability, but in the early years of the war, it allowed them to hunt with terrifying efficiency. The ocean seemed to teem with invisible eyes that watched every move the convoys made. The period known as the Happy Time began in the summer of 1940, after the fall of France gave the German Navy direct access to the Atlantic. Submarines could now operate from bases on the French coast, which greatly extended their range and time on patrol. Allied escorts were scarce and poorly equipped, and they lacked the radar and aircraft needed to detect the surface raiders at night. It was a slaughter as merchant ships were sunk with impunity and submarine commanders returned to port with pennants flying to mark their victories. The British Navy was stretched to the breaking point and could do little to stop the carnage. One particularly harrowing event occurred when a large convoy designated SC-7 was intercepted by a wolf pack in October of 1940. The slow-moving column of 35 merchant ships was carrying vital timber and grain and steel to the port of Liverpool. As the sun set over the cold Atlantic waters, the shadows of German submarines began to close in from all sides like sharks circling a wounded whale. The escort force consisted of only a few corvettes and sloops, which were hopelessly outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the attacking boats. The stage was set for a night of destruction that would shock the British Admiralty. The attack began under the cover of a moonless night as torpedoes slammed into the sides of the defenseless freighters. Explosions lit up the horizon and turned the dark ocean into a hellscape of burning oil and twisted metal. Ships broke in two and sank within minutes, while desperate sailors leaped into the freezing water to escape the inferno. The wolf pack tore through the convoy ranks and fired torpedoes at will before diving to evade the counterattacks of the overwhelmed escorts. By the time dawn broke, the convoy had been decimated, and the sea was littered with wreckage and the bodies of those who could not be saved. The question that haunted the Allied leaders was whether they could sustain these losses without collapsing under the strain of the blockade. Every ship that sank took with it thousands of tons of supplies that were needed to build tanks and planes and feed the civilian population. The shipyards of Britain and later the United States worked day and night to replace the lost tonnage, but for a long time the sinking rate exceeded the production rate. It was a grim mathematical equation where the variable was human lives, and the result would determine the fate of the free world. The Atlantic had become a graveyard. The primary defense against the submarine threat was the corvette, which was a small and agile warship designed for anti-submarine warfare. These vessels were cheap to build and could be produced in large numbers to fill the gap in the escort screens. They were notoriously uncomfortable in rough seas and bobbed like corks on the massive Atlantic swells, which caused endless seasickness for their crews. Despite their size, the corvettes were heavily armed with depth charges and sonar equipment to hunt down the underwater raiders. They were the terriers of the sea, and they barked and bit at the wolves to protect the flock. However, the Flower-class corvettes had significant limitations that the German commanders learned to exploit during the early campaigns. They were slower than a surface submarine, which meant they could not chase down the enemy if the U-boat decided to run on the surface. Their radar was primitive or non-existent in the early days, and their sonar was useless against a submarine that was attacking on the surface. The brave crews of these small ships fought with immense courage, but they were often fighting a losing battle against the superior speed and tactics of the German aces. They needed better technology and more support to turn the tide. The greatest danger zone for the convoys was the area in the mid-Atlantic known as the Black Pit, where land-based aircraft could not reach. Allied planes provided crucial protection near the coasts by spotting submarines and forcing them to dive where they were slow and blind. But in the vast gap between North America and Iceland and Britain, the convoys were on their own against the wolf packs. It was here that the submarines gathered to feast on the merchant ships without fear of aerial attack. Closing this air gap became the primary objective for the Allied naval strategists as the war dragged on. The entry of the United States into the war in late 1941 brought a new wave of targets for the German submarine fleet. Admiral Donitz launched Operation Drumbeat and sent his long-range boats to patrol the eastern coast of America. The American cities had not yet enforced blackouts, and the merchant ships sailed with their lights on against the backdrop of glowing coastal towns. It was a shooting gallery for the experienced German commanders who sank ships within sight of the beaches and boardwalks. The second happy time had begun, and the tonnage losses skyrocketed to catastrophic new levels. Submarines prowled the waters from New York to the Caribbean and preyed on the tanker traffic that carried vital fuel for the war effort. The warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico became a hunting ground where burning oil slicks marked the graves of countless vessels. The American Navy was slow to adopt the convoy system and refused to learn from the hard-won lessons of the British. This reluctance cost them dearly in ships and lives until they finally organized their defenses and drove the submarines away from the coast. The war had truly become a global conflict that touched every shore. But the tide eventually began to turn as the Allies mobilized their industrial might and scientific genius to defeat the underwater menace. The race was not just about building more ships, but about developing superior technology to detect and destroy the invisible enemy. Scientists on both sides of the Atlantic worked in secret laboratories to create better radar and sonar and direction-finding equipment. The battle shifted from a contest of seamanship to a war of electrons and frequencies where the first side to see the other would win. The German advantage of stealth was slowly being eroded by the relentless march of innovation. The most critical breakthrough in the intelligence war was the cracking of the German Enigma code by the code breakers at Bletchley Park. The captured Enigma machines and codebooks allowed the Allies to read the secret radio traffic between the submarine fleet and their headquarters. This intelligence, known as Ultra, gave the convoy routers the ability to steer ships away from known Wolfpack locations. It was a secret weapon of immense power that saved countless lives by avoiding battles before they even began. The Germans remained unaware that their communications were compromised and continued to broadcast their positions freely. The brilliant mathematician Alan Turing and his team built massive electromechanical machines called bombs to decipher the complex Enigma settings each day. It was a race against time, as the settings changed every 24 hours and the codebreakers had to start from scratch. The information they gleaned was used carefully to avoid raising German suspicions about the security of their codes. This shadow war of logic and probability played a decisive role in the Atlantic campaign and proved that mathematics could be as lethal as torpedoes. The mind was becoming the most dangerous weapon of all. On the tactical level, the introduction of centimetric radar revolutionized the ability of aircraft and ships to detect surface submarines. Unlike the older systems, this new radar could spot a small object like a conning tower or a periscope amidst the clutter of the waves. The German submarines could no longer hide in the darkness or the fog, as the electronic eyes of the Allies pierced through the gloom. A device called high-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF, allowed escort ships to pinpoint the location of a submarine the moment it transmitted a radio signal. The hunters were being stripped of their cloak of invisibility. The night was no longer a sanctuary for the submarines, thanks to the invention of the light, which was mounted on patrol aircraft. This powerful searchlight was linked to the radar and automatically illuminated the target when the plane was on its final attack run. Submarine crews who thought they were safe in the darkness would suddenly be blinded by a dazzling beam of light seconds before depth charges rained down on them. The psychological impact was devastating, as the German sailors realized there was no time of day when they were safe from attack. The hunter had nowhere left to hide. The deadly air gap in the mid-Atlantic was finally closed by the introduction of escort carriers, which were small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls. These baby flat tops accompanied the convoys and provided a continuous umbrella of air cover across the entire ocean crossing. Their planes could patrol for miles around the convoy and force submarines to dive or attack them with rockets and depth charges. The presence of air power completely disrupted the Wolfpack tactics, which relied on surface mobility and coordination. The submarines were forced underwater, where they were slow and blind and vulnerable. Specialized hunter-killer groups were formed with the sole purpose of tracking down and destroying submarines rather than just protecting convoys. Led by aggressive commanders like Captain Johnny Walker, these groups used relentless tactics to pursue a contact until the submarine was forced to surface for air. They would wait for hours or even days above a submerged boat and drop depth charges at irregular intervals to break the morale of the trapped crew. This offensive shift turned the tables completely and put the German fleet on the defensive for the first time in the war. The predators were being hunted to extinction. The turning point of the campaign arrived in May of 1943, which became known to the Germans as Black May. In that single month, the Allies sank 41 U-boats while losing comparatively few merchant ships to attack. The Wolfpacks were decimated as they tried to attack the heavily defended convoys and encountered a wall of radar and aircraft and aggressive escorts. It was a massacre that shocked the German high command and proved that the technological gap had become insurmountable. The hunters had lost their edge, and the Atlantic was becoming a German graveyard. Admiral Donitz recognized the futility of continuing the slaughter and ordered his submarines to withdraw from the North Atlantic temporarily. It was a stunning admission of defeat for the arm of the Navy that had once brought Britain to the brink of starvation. The withdrawal marked the end of the large-scale Wolfpack attacks and signaled the shifting momentum of the entire war. The supply lines to Britain were now secure, and the massive buildup of American troops and equipment for the invasion of Europe could proceed without interference. The Battle of the Atlantic had been won by the Allies. The psychological toll on the remaining submarine crews was immense, as their chances of survival plummeted with every mission. They knew that sailing out of port was likely a one-way trip, and morale began to crack under the strain of inevitable defeat. The camaraderie that had once sustained them turned into a grim fatalism as they watched their friends disappear one by one. Yet they continued to sail and obey orders driven by a sense of duty and the harsh discipline of the naval service. They were ghosts sailing in steel coffins and waiting for the end. In a desperate attempt to regain the initiative, German engineers developed the Schnorchel device, which allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged. This breathing tube meant the boats did not have to surface to recharge their batteries and could remain underwater for weeks. It was a significant tactical improvement that reduced their vulnerability to radar and aircraft attacks. However, the device was difficult to use and limited the speed of the boat, making it a defensive measure rather than an offensive game changer. It came too late to alter the strategic outcome of the war. The true technological marvel that might have changed everything was the Type 21 submarine, which was the first true underwater vessel. It was designed to operate almost entirely submerged with high underwater speeds and advanced sonar and rapid reload torpedo systems. If these boats had been produced in large numbers 2 years earlier, they could have devastated the Allied convoys. But the German industry was being pounded by Allied bombing, and production delays meant that only a handful ever saw combat. It was a case of too little and too late for the Third Reich. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June of 1944 forced the German Navy to abandon their bases on the French coast. The submarines were pushed back to ports in Norway and Germany, which drastically reduced their operational range and effectiveness. They had to navigate through the heavily mined and patrolled waters around the British Isles just to reach the shipping lanes. The net was tightening around them, and the operational area was shrinking day by day. The once mighty fleet was now cornered and fighting for its very existence. In the final months of the war, the submarine campaign became a disjointed and desperate effort to inflict any damage possible. Individual boats sortied into British coastal waters and tried to ambush ships in the shallow seas. It was a suicide mission for most, as the coastal defenses were impenetrable and the waters were teeming with hunter-killer groups. The seasoned aces were long dead, and the new crews were inexperienced and barely trained for the complex machinery they operated. They were sent out as sacrificial pawns in a game that was already lost. When the final surrender order came in May of 1945, the captains were instructed to surface and fly a black flag of surrender. Most of the remaining boats at sea complied and were escorted into British ports by the very ships they had tried to sink. However, many commanders chose to scuttle their vessels rather than hand them over to the enemy. They opened the valves and sent their boats to the bottom in a final act of defiance. The pride of the German Navy ended the war as twisted wreckage on the seabed. The Allies launched Operation Deadlight after the war to dispose of the captured German submarine fleet. More than 100 U-boats were towed out to the deep waters of the Atlantic and sunk by naval gunfire and aerial bombing. It was a symbolic funeral for the weapon that had terrorized the oceans for 6 years. The explosions that sent them to the bottom echoed the violence of the war they had waged. The metal carcasses settled into the darkness and joined the thousands of merchant ships they had destroyed. The question remains whether the submarine campaign was a failure or a near success that was defeated by circumstance. Historians argue that if Germany had prioritized submarine production earlier, the outcome might have been different. The narrow margin by which the Allies won the tonnage war suggests that the threat was existential and terrifyingly real. It was not a decisive victory from the start, but a grinding war of attrition that could have tipped either way. The silent hunters had come dangerously close to severing the lifeline of the free world. The analysis of the conflict reveals that the Battle of the Atlantic was the longest and most complex naval campaign in history. It pitted the industrial output of the Allies against the tactical innovation of the German Navy. The victory was not won by a single battle, but by the cumulative effort of sailors and scientists and dock workers. It proved that in modern warfare, logistics and technology are as important as courage and firepower. The tonnage war was the foundation upon which the liberation of Europe was built. The human cost of this silent war was staggering, with 30,000 out of 40,000 German submariners never returning home. This 75% casualty rate was the highest of any branch of service in the war. On the Allied side, more than 30,000 merchant seamen and naval personnel lost their lives in the freezing waters. The ocean floor is scattered with the bones of young men from both sides who died in the darkness of the deep. It is a vast and silent cemetery that spans thousands of miles. The merchant marines who sailed the convoys were civilians who faced the horrors of war with little protection or recognition. They watched their shipmates burn in oil fires or freeze in the icy waves, and yet they signed up for the next voyage. Their sacrifice was the fuel that kept the Allied war machine running during the darkest days. Without their quiet courage, the tanks and planes and soldiers would never have reached the battlefields of Europe. They were the unsung heroes of the Atlantic. The legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic serves as a grim reminder of the fragility of global supply lines in times of war. It demonstrated the devastating potential of submarine warfare to cripple a nation's economy and will to fight. The lessons learned in those cold waters shaped naval strategy for decades to come and influenced the design of modern nuclear submarines. The cat and mouse game continues today beneath the waves, but the stakes have never been higher than they were in those desperate years. Today, the rusting hulls of the U-boats and the merchant ships lie together in the abyssal plains of the Atlantic. They are slowly being consumed by the sea and returning to the elements from which they were forged. Marine life now inhabits the control rooms where men once fought for their lives, and coral grows on the torpedo tubes. The silence of the deep has reclaimed the battlefield and erased the sounds of explosions and screaming metal. Only the history books remain to tell the story. The Silent War was a contest of endurance and innovation, where the margin between victory and defeat was measured in inches of steel and seconds of time. It was a struggle that defined the course of the 20th century and proved the resilience of the human spirit against overwhelming odds. The hunters and the hunted share the same peace now in the eternal darkness of the ocean floor. Their story is a whisper of time that echoes through the waves forever.